Hello and welcome to the Rogers Brief. I'm Adam Rogers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. Today is day 50 of the Mass Casualty Commission proceedings, a milestone of some note, I guess. I'd say we're probably more than halfway through the proceedings, but wouldn't be surprised if we get up into the high 70s, low 80s by the time we're done with the various witnesses and different discussion panels that are going on. Today wasn't, thankfully, a discussion panel. There were two things that happened. One was a foundational document presentation dealing with the financial misdealings, is how the commission puts it. The illegal financial activity would be another way of putting it, for the most part, with Gabriel Wortman's dealings with his friends, his family, the government, more or less anybody that he dealt with. He had different financial arrangements that were illegal, improper as vis-a-vis the taxman and insurance companies and others. So we'll talk about that a little bit. One of the first things that came out about Gabriel Wortman was that he seemed to be really wealthy for a denturist. And so there were some questions about illegal activity. There's suggestions that all this cash, hundreds of thousands of dollars in cash, was either found at the property, hidden on his property, or potentially burned in the course of the fires which he set on his property. So those were all questions that were out there in the early days following the mass shootings. So we'll talk about that a little bit. The other thing that happened was there was a witness. This was Constable Troy Maxwell, who's now a retired RCMP officer. He's been retired for a couple of years. Constable Maxwell was the officer to whom Brenda Forbes, who we heard from last week, says that she made a report of domestic violence, a serious domestic violence incident involving Lisa Banfield. Constable Maxwell had a different story in his statement to the Mass Casualty Commission, and he kept to that story today. So I'll talk about that a little bit, the significance of the discrepancy, and also just sort of walk you through a little bit of how a judge would deal with this if this was a criminal court situation, with two starkly different accounts of a key piece of evidence. So that was what was going on today. The foundational document was presented by a lawyer, Ronki Akinyemi. Ms. Akinyemi is a new graduated in 2019 from Osgoode Law School in Ontario, and is an Ontario lawyer. Not quite sure. I think this is her first appearance, or maybe at least her first featured appearance. So anyway, just another in the long procession of lawyers that the Mass Casualty Commission seems to have retained, and everybody gets their time speaking. Ms. Akinyemi did a fine job of it today, but curious as to how necessary each one of these additional individuals might be that are all certainly on the payroll. So Wortman had a denturist clinic, and both he and Miss Banfield were working there, but they only reported, in his case, $40,000 a year on average in income. In her case, just over $15,000 in income. But that wasn't their real income, because the Department of Community Services had records that between 2015 and 2020, they paid over $434,000 to Wortman's clinic, averaging of just under $87,000 a year. So that was, of course, there's expenses and all that stuff, but if that was a portion of his revenue, then the $40,000 income figure may not have been accurate just on its own merits. Ms. Banfield talked about they often did deals for cash. It was also that Wortman would charge the insurance company the full rate, but then not make the client pay their co-pay amount, and so he would get the full amount. The client wouldn't have to pay their portion. The insurance company would get ripped off, and so there were some complaints about that over the years. Some other cash dealings. Actually, there was a time in 2010, TD Bank sent a suspicious transactions report. This is so anything where it's over $10,000. If they think there's criminal activity involved, they send a report to what's called FinTrack. So TD Bank did that, sent it to FinTrack. FinTrack didn't send that on to the RCMP or any other local police in Nova Scotia, so nothing came of that report. So how did he get all this money? Well, there's three theories or contributing factors. One is a definite thing, which is he gained from the estate of his friend, sexual partner, it seems, Tom Evans, who was a lawyer up in Fredericton, a lawyer who's got in considerable trouble with the law up there himself, was suspended, I think disbarred at one point, for sexual offenses against young boys, and where he'd supplied them with alcohol. There was allegations of that he was involved in illegal activities as well. This is Tom Evans. But also allegations that Evans and Wortman together were involved in illegal... After Evans couldn't practice law, that he was dealing drugs, involved in that trade, then got Wortman involved in that as well, and that the two of them together were involved in smuggling illegal weapons across the U.S. border. So all of that is sort of alleged. Nothing's really been dug into enough to know a full story there, but the other side of it is that he gained from Tom Evans's estate. He was the sole beneficiary, but it seemed like he lied about Tom Evans's estate in the probate documents. It's hard to know how relevant that is. Some of Tom Evans's holdings were actually in corporations, and it looked like Wortman might have been a shareholder in some of them, so may have... anyway, he got all of Tom Evans's property, which was several $100,000 worth there when he died 10 plus years ago, I think now. So that was one suggestion. The drug dealing, which appeared to have continued beyond Tom Evans's death. There was a receipt on a cannabis sale from I think just over 10 years ago that they were able to find in Wortman's possessions, suggesting that he had a deal at that time that involved 5 pounds of cannabis. Suggestion from witnesses that he was supplying cocaine to people in the Portapique area. So there was certainly some revenue generation going on there. Nothing that you might want to put into a bank either and have tracked, although we did have several $100,000 in the bank as well. So this brings us to, I guess, the most important part of that element of the story, which was the suggestion that Wortman was a confidential informant for the RCMP. And this was driven largely, well, by two things. One is the fact that he was never really arrested or treated seriously by the RCMP throughout his time, and with all of these abuse allegations, other things that he had going on, didn't seem to attract the attention of police like you might expect he would have. But the other was this very specific transaction of $475,000, which he got just before the killings from the Brinks location in Burnside Industrial Park. So normally, if you're getting cash, even a large amount of cash, the process is that you go to the bank branch, they order the cash in, they wouldn't have it on hand, they order it in, the branch manager was there and goes through your ID, make sure you are who you say you are, does all that verification, and then turn the cash over. In this case, they went through Brinks, purportedly for extra security, but it seemed to draw suspicion because that seems like that is how a confidential informant might be paid. You get a ticket, you go to Brinks, here's my ticket, they hand you a bag that corresponds to that ticket, and nobody knows or recounts or does any of that stuff, you just walk away with it. So it seemed to draw that inference. But here we have today documented internal communications within CIBC that they were aware of the request. He had the $475,000 in a GIC and a line of credit, wanted to withdraw it. They were trying to talk him out of it, thought it was a bad idea, were worried that he might have been, Wortman that is, might be being, blackmailed or tricked into taking this money out to give to somebody else for nefarious purposes, all those things. So there was all these conversations going on internally at CIBC with their security people, all that would suggest that it was just a regular but large transaction They didn't think anything too much of it, given that his age, that he may have been, moderately successful through his career, and just save that money up. So they didn't turn their mind to how suspicious it may have appeared. Now, does this close the door entirely on the theory that he may have been a confidential informant? Well, not entirely, because how did the money get there? Nobody knows that. Where did the money come from? Was it drug dealing? Was it confidential informant? Payoffs? Was this, payoffs over time? These are all still possibilities which haven't been refuted, although it's hard to you can't refute everything, of course. It's easier to prove than to refute many cases. So the problem is the RCMP, by their own standards, by their own manual on how to treat confidential informants, are permitted, and I say permitted, not legally, but permitted within their own context, to lie to anybody about a confidential informant except a sitting judge in a court. Well, the Mass Casualty Commission is not a court, and there is no sitting judge. So there's, by the RCMP's own standards, nothing wrong with them lying to the Mass Casualty Commission about this. Now, I did happen to pick out a name that I recognized in there, and that is superintendent. I knew him as constable, David Estefan. He was based in Antigonish at the street crime unit when I was a new young lawyer doing some work, some federal prosecution, and worked with Constable Estefan and others in the detachment there on drug cases and such. Superintendent Estefan struck me at the time certainly as a straight shooter, somebody that I wouldn't expect to be involved in anything terribly nefarious in this respect, but who knows whether he was all in charge of that. He's the supervisor now of those kind of operations, confidential informant operations throughout the country. So he's come along a little ways in 15 years' time. So the other... all right, so lots of questions still remaining from his financial misdealings. An area where, whether they haven't felt they've been able to or they just haven't been willing to delve, is the area of potential drug dealing and all these things that where it seems that Wortman was potentially fairly heavily involved. He was up in Port Pickle often and all those things. So, of course, Lisa Banfield has denied any knowledge of this, as she would. Second thing I want to talk to, though, is getting to Constable Troy Maxwell and his testimony. So, Constable Maxwell, I just recall from him introducing himself today, was based in Port Hawkesbury and Wakaba before he was transferred to Colchester. I never had a case with Troy Maxwell that I can recall, but I did recognize the name. His notes were disclosed. He testified. So he testified about a complaint made by Brenda Forbes. Brenda Forbes, being the former neighbor of Gabriel Wortman, moved away after he terrorized her over these complaints about domestic violence complaints that she made to the RCMP about him regarding Lisa Banfield. Okay, so Miss Forbes says she spoke to Constable Maxwell at the DeBert Flight Center, as she was there as not scouts, but above that, a cadets program, and that it was the domestic assault allegation that Glenn Wortman had passed on to her. She passed on to Constable Maxwell, put Glenn Wortman on the speakerphone, and Glenn Wortman, within earshot of Constable Maxwell, according to Miss Forbes, says, "No, I'm not saying anything about Gabriel Wortman. He'll kill me." So what does Troy Maxwell say? It was a driving complaint that Wortman was driving too fast and recklessly around the community, and it was being a nuisance. So he went to Portapic, tried to speak with Wortman. He wasn't home. Hoped to catch him in the act of driving. Didn't do that. Gave him a call. Told him there was a complaint, and that was the end of it. All right. I noticed in Constable Maxwell's testimony that he talked a few times about what an officer has to do to close off a file, and that, as though that's the goal, right? To close off a file, just get rid of it, move on to the next thing. All right, that may have been what he was doing here without having a witness. I mean, Glenn Wortman wasn't going to testify. Brenda Forbes didn't see it directly, so anything she said would be hearsay. So there really, in a sense, wasn't a case unless you dig into it and start investigating, talk to Glenn Wortman directly, talk to Richard Ellison directly, talk to some of these people, which Constable Maxwell didn't do. Well, he says he didn't do it because it was just a driving complaint. But, so what would a judge do with these two starkly different accounts? One thing you look at is Constable Maxwell does many investigations, hundreds a year. How is he going to remember something that, relatively insignificant in his mind, perhaps something from 9 years ago? On the other hand, a civilian that makes a complaint to the police may do so once in their life, very few times ever. And so it's more likely that it's going to stick in their mind as to exactly what happened. It would be a dramatic thing that would, hold in your memory. Now, on the other hand, so the other thing is Constable Maxwell's notes. They mention Glenn Wortman. They mention Richard Ellison. There's the name Lisa is in the margins. All consistent with Brenda Forbes' account of what she explained, none of which is consistent with just a simple driving complaint. The other thing and the final thing is the statement from Constable Maxwell in his statement to the Mass Casualty Commission that there was a decommissioned police car in Wortman's yard when he went to show up. Wortman didn't have a decommissioned car at that time. It was 2013. He didn't have one until 2019. So all of the known elements are consistent with Brenda Forbes' account. I mean, she testified last week. I know some have been critical of her demeanor. She was shaking a little bit, and maybe she was nervous. She said later on that she had a bit of a stutter, so maybe she was just trying to control herself during her statement, a stressful situation. So of those, I think a judge hearing this case would prefer Miss Forbes' version and would find a way to say something about Constable Maxwell that didn't speak too directly to his credibility. It was kind of painful actually to watch him at times struggle to answer questions, especially with Josh Bryson asking him questions that, he just didn't have any answers. He didn't remember things. He couldn't explain why he would write somebody's name in there if they had nothing to do with a driving complaint. All these things, you could tell he was trying to stay on that point. But of course, he has a lot at stake, and so does the RCMP. So if he says, yeah, it was a domestic violence complaint and I just did nothing about it, well, then, that sort of cascading effect, leads on to, something could have been done at this stage if you had done your job properly. So he doesn't want to admit that. The RCMP doesn't want him probably to admit that either, because that would draw an institutional liability as well. So he's going to stick to that story no matter what. And but it was, I could tell he was struggling to answer those questions and try to maintain his own credibility while doing so. So those are the two things that happened today. We're back tomorrow with further discussion panels to talk about domestic violence. So we'll see how that goes. We'll see if we learn anything new with our 5th, 6th, 7th academic discussion panel on domestic violence, gender-based violence, intimate partner violence. All very important, but there's the clock is ticking, and there's a lot of these discussions happening, and we're not learning anything new. So we'll see what happens. I'll watch it tomorrow and report back to you after the fact as to what, if anything, of significance has taken place. So until then, thank you again for watching today, and thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.